Good afternoon, everybody. So today I would like to look at the sort of question of medieval liturgical music in Ireland, and the sort of time frame I've taken is roughly from around 1100 up to, we could say, the Reformation, up to about the 1540, and to look at some of the developments of that. When I read the little blurb on the programme, I thought there were sort of big claims being made when it sort of talked about the early church origins of choral music. That might annoy some people, but I think we can say that is a fact in terms, in at least certainly in the Irish context. But we will talk more about that as we go on. So, medieval liturgical music. What do I mean by that? And by this context of the period 1100 to 1540. By liturgy, of course, I mean the official, the public worship of the Christian Church. And of course, in the medieval period, the Christian Church in the West was undivided. So we're talking about a single Catholic Church, a single Christian Church throughout Western Europe, as we know it. I think a few things we could say, just to sort of, this will all be known to you already, but just to sort of refresh, just in terms of Christianity and music, how central it was in medieval Christianity. And I think we need to actually get modern ideas of Christianity out of our heads for a moment, whether it's Catholic or Anglican or Presbyterian or anything else. The world of medieval Christianity was a very different world. So I think we need to sort of approach it on its own terms and not with some modern mindsets and that. So I think the first thing that might take us by surprise is that in medieval liturgy, music, I would say, is liturgy. Now that might sound heretical, but it's actually not heretical. What do I mean by that? I mean that so many of the texts that we take for granted that are now spoken, like the Curated, the Gloria, the Creed, the Sanctus, all of these texts were originally intended to be sung. They were not intended to be spoken. So we have to switch mentality for a moment and think that the default mode in Christian worship was music, was singing. The default mode was not to speak. That's a much later development, and there's all sorts of complicated historical reasons for that, with the multiplication of daily masses and everything, and them sort of post-Enlightenment realities and that. So music, I think, as liturgy is the first thing to sort of keep in mind, that the liturgy was sung, not spoken, that singing was the norm. Of course, on a practical level, in a large building in an era before amplification and electricity, that had a practical purpose as well. If you think of, say, someplace like St. Patrick's Cathedral, if I was speaking like this in the choir of St. Patrick's Cathedral, I wouldn't be heard quarter of the way down the building. Whereas if I started just to articulate it like this and to monotone and do an intonation of it, suddenly the sound takes off and it travels throughout the building, and it can be heard at the back door, at the west door, and it transforms everything. So that's The next point is just to do with literacy, that just one of the realities. I often find this with students, particularly in the contemporary climate in Ireland, anything to do with religion is sort of anathema. Whether you're a believer or you're not a believer is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is the Christian Church was a major institution in European society for over a millennium. You cannot understand European society without understanding Christianity. That doesn't mean you have to be sympathetic to it or anything, but you can't understand it. It's like trying to understand Syria or Egypt without understanding something about Islam. You get a very warped picture. And within that medieval world of medieval Christianity, of course, it was an elite culture, it was a literate culture where the great value was placed on literacy. And of course, education is connected to that. If you wanted to be educated, the chances of being educated generally in medieval society were through the church. The church provided the opportunities, and often for very talented and very poor people who actually did make a career and got on thanks to an ecclesiastical education that was often provided by the cathedral schools, and then of course the universities are the successors to the cathedral schools in medieval Europe. And then the other important point about the Christian Church and liturgy and music is that the church was the major institution of patronage, the source of patronage in medieval society, along with the aristocracy and the monarchy. I think in Ireland that has an added importance, the church patronage, because we did not have a centralised monarchy in this country before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. We hadn't arrived at that stage of political development that Scotland had arrived at. And I will come back to that again, because I think that is key to understanding an awful lot about medieval Ireland and why certain things never developed here. Because Dublin never was the capital with a king. It was just a secondary city with a viceroy for most of the medieval period. And before that, it was a minor kingdom, but not a capital in the way that Edinburgh was or Holyrood. We never had that, and that's something I think crucial to acknowledge, because otherwise we risk sort of going into all sorts of other crazy ideas about Celtic exceptionalism and all sorts of rubbish like that. So we'll just move on. So So let's just say Christian liturgy, just to get a sense of that, the music within that. I'm going to just do this very, very quickly, because I'm sure you all know that. So by liturgy, I mean the official public worship of the church, not private devotions, not what you do in your own house or on the side of a mountain or anything else. What goes on as a community, as the ecclesia gathered in public in the church. And the two main branches of that, the two structures of that, if you like, that we tend to, for analytical purposes, divide it into are the Mass, or the Eucharist, and the office. So the Mass or Eucharist, I think anybody who's a practicing Christian will be familiar with as the celebration of the Last Supper and the commemoration of that. The office, probably, particularly Catholics, will be less familiar with that, because we've no real tradition of the public performance of the office in Ireland, unlike the continent. So the office basically is a series of liturgies through the day that punctuate the day. So some of those names will be familiar to you, maybe Matins or Vigils, Lauds, Vespers, Compline. The office was performed in cathedral churches and in monasteries, so in every monastery or nunnery, and in a cathedral church. And then in larger urban areas where there was a collegiate church, that was the function of a collegiate church. So some places like Youghal, Galway, Goran and Kilkenny, there are various few of them around the country. That was the function of the clergy living in community there, was to celebrate the office on a daily basis. So there's just a list, I won't go into those in detail, of the various offices through the day. The important ones in terms of music, and the music that they've left us in terms of notable musical settings, would be sort of some of the big Matins responsories, the responsories from Matins, which are scriptural texts commenting on the readings that are in Matins, and some of those are very elaborate. They're very elaborate in the chant settings. They're also, then you get polyphonic settings of them. And then the other one area that produced a lot of music was Vespers. Of course, at sunset, you wouldn't have many people at Lauds in the morning, but Vespers, medieval Vespers, the public would have gone to. And so the Magnificat settings certainly there are important. And then in the context of the British Isles, at Compline, one of the sort of uniquely English phenomena that would have spread here as well were the big, great polyphonic Marian antiphons. So those Marian antiphons that are sung at the end of Compline, that service at the end of the day, before the day ends, the Salve Regina, the Regina Caeli, Alma Redemptoris Mater, Ave Regina Caelorum, that go through, punctuate the liturgical year. One of the phenomena in late medieval England was sort of great big polyphonic settings of those, some of them that lasted 15 and 20 minutes, and that would have been sung in the Lady Chapel of the cathedrals. So there's a lot of music that comes out of that Compline setting in the late medieval period. Just looking at the Mass for a moment, just very briefly, there's two types of music there, of chants, that we, again, just for purposes of analysis, that we talk about: proper chants and ordinary chants. The ordinary chants you'll all be familiar with. If you know any polyphonic Mass that you're familiar with, it's the ordinary chants that are set: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Agnus Dei. The proper chants are the chants that are specific to a day. So in other words, Christmas Day has its proper chants, Easter Sunday has its proper chants that are specific, that are thematic, that are only suitable for that day and not suitable to be regurgitated on other days, whereas the ordinary chants are used right throughout the year. So that's the sort of principal distinction there between those. Just some other elements then: the liturgical year, the Christian liturgical year. Again, most of you are familiar with it already, but begins in Advent, so the 4 Sundays preceding Christmas, runs through Christmas. The very important feasts in the year, like Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, will have an octave, so the 8 days after the feast are equally important as well. We have Epiphany, the period we're in now, Sundays after Epiphany, Lent and Ash Wednesday and the 5 Sundays of Lent, Holy Week, Easter and its octave, the Sundays after Easter, Pentecost and its octave, and the Sundays after Pentecost bring us right back then to sort of late November, and we're off again with Advent. So that's called the temporal cycle. So that runs with the year in that way. And of course it's all pushed about a little bit then. Lent is pushed about by the date of Easter and all of that sort of, so it's not fixed on specific dates of the calendar. The sanctuary cycle, if you like, is fixed. So if we just take December, for example, I'm taking sort of medieval calendar here, not a contemporary one. You'd have St. Nicholas, St. Lucy, St. Thomas Becket, Sylvester, January a few days ago, St. Hilary on the 13th, Conversion of St. Paul coming up on the 25th, etc. So they're fixed on fixed specific dates in the calendar, like St. Patrick's Day, St. Bridget, etc., that we're all familiar with. So that's just in a nutshell the context that I think is important to get a sense of the liturgical context, and the fact that this is going on in churches all over Europe every day in, day out, every year, throughout monastic churches, nunneries, and cathedral churches, and then to a lesser extent in parish churches and that. But the cathedral churches and the collegiate churches and the monasteries, that's their principal duty, is the performance of the office and the performance of the liturgy, the full liturgy, on a daily basis. I want to then set that into an Irish context a little, and into this period of sort of 1100, or even pushing it back a bit to the year 1000, up to about 1540, 1600. So I think you can talk about a long Middle Ages in Ireland. I mean, people joke, I think James Joyce joked and others have joked that the Middle Ages really didn't end till the 20th century. Some would say they ended in the 1960s. That's a little bit unfair, but certainly we can talk about a long medieval period. In approaching all of this, what I want to do today is look at medieval Ireland, but look at it in a European context and look at it from the sources that survive, the documentary sources that survive, the musical sources that can tell us something about the music that was performed and used in medieval Ireland, what that can tell us about influences from outside, from continental Europe. And those sources are not very many, we have to say that. There's only, the number of musical sources, actual books with music in them from that period, there's about 15, 18 of them. That's it, which is a very small number. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, that's more than has survived from Wales or from Scotland, fewer than England. There was a huge destruction of books, it's just a historical fact, huge destruction of books at the Reformation. An estimate has been done for England and Wales, based on the surviving books, based on what each parish church would have needed to have for the celebration of the liturgy. There were around, of the office books alone, antiphoners, so the book just for the celebration of the office, that's not the Mass, so the daily office, there were about 25,000 of those in pre-Reformation England. Surviving now, there are fewer than 15. So that just gives you an idea of the scale of destruction. Then there's a sort of a double whammy in Ireland. First there's a Reformation, and then there are all of those wars of the 17th century. So if something didn't get destroyed in the Reformation, it got destroyed in the 17th century. And actually we have to be very grateful to two groups of scholars, the Irish Franciscans in the 17th century, Micheál Cléric and his companions, and also Archbishop Usher and James Ware on the Church of Ireland side. Were it not for them, we'd have nothing now. So it was through their interest and through their work, and actually through their collaboration with each other as well, that what survives in various libraries, whether it's the Library of Trinity College here, or in the British Library in London, or in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, or the University Library in Cambridge, it's generally thanks to those far-sighted people in the mid-17th century, in the 1630s, 1640s, who were collecting what they could get their hands on. And we know from accounts, say from Geoffrey Keating and others from that time in the 1630s, that there were other books that were destroyed then, that they knew about in the 1630s and that were subsequently destroyed, that they don't exist now. So that's one of the challenges for anybody in any aspect of medieval studies, I think, is looking back, is how do you reconstruct this past? How do you make sense of it without wafting off into all sorts of fairy-eyed Celtic mysticism and all that? How do you work with this, and how do you work with the sources, and what can the sources tell us? And I think a very important point I would always say about this is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think that's a very important point in it. So because something doesn't survive doesn't mean that it didn't exist. Now that's what makes it also tricky to work with this area. So this time frame that I'm using here, sort of 1000 to 1600, why do I put Brian Boru there? Brian Boru buried in Armagh in 1014, because I think actually that whole Brian Boru gaining the high kingship, and Brian Boru's relationship with Armagh, where he goes and lays the 20 ounces of gold on the altar in 1005, and they declare him the Emperor of the Irish. There's all this grandiose stuff going on between the Church of Armagh and the O'Briens, setting them up as with his imperial connotations, and then when he dies, he's called the Augustus of northwestern Europe and all that grandiose stuff. But what's going on in all that? We can laugh at that and we can sneer at it, and that what's going on in that, I think, in my mind, is they're actually in touch with the continent. They're looking at what's going on in Germany in particular, and the Ottonian emperors in Germany, the Holy Roman emperors, the Ottonians, and as the Ottonians are sort of rebuilding and restoring the empire there, others are looking in. The English kings are looking in. The Irish are looking at it as well. Of course, they're travelling as well. As I say to my students always, you're not the first generation to travel. They travelled to Rome in the Middle Ages. They travelled all over Europe. It's amazing how much they travelled. It's just it took a little bit more time. And of course, you have kings of Dublin, various Irish kings, heading on pilgrimage to Rome. On the way to Rome, they pass through Cologne, they pass through various places, they see things, they get ideas, they see how things are done in Germany, they come back with ideas, they come back with airs and graces, they come back with all sorts of... So that's what's going on. So I think that a whole process, I think, is sort of set in motion already in the 11th century. Now, we don't have any musical sources from that period. Once we get into the 12th century, then we do have musical sources. Of course, the big thing, the 12th century is a very complicated and very exciting time in Irish history. I think it's the century before the 20th century when we were most in touch with continental Europe and most outward looking, and then we closed in and became very Anglo-centric for about 800 years. But the 12th century, there's a lot of contact with the with the continent, and you have a series of synods and councils within the church attempting to sort of, the word reform is used a lot. I don't like that word. I think it's very problematic. But to modernise, I think is maybe a better word, to bring it into line with continental Europe. Part of that process is establishing territorial dioceses and that. So there's a series of councils held 1101, 1111, 1152. And in fact, the diocesan boundaries that the Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland have today are those that were set in 1152. They haven't changed. It just shows you how conservative this country is. There's no other country in Europe that has diocesan boundaries that are still intact after 800 and 900 years. So what's going on in this period in the 12th century? I would see it as a Europeanization, as partly the elite of Irish society, the elite in the church, bishops and abbots, but also the elite in terms of the provincial kings like Dermot MacMurrough, the O'Briens, the various provincial kings, looking to the continent and wanting to sort of, we like what we see in Cologne, we like what we saw in Rome, we like what we saw in wherever else it was, Bruges or Ghent, and we want to have that. That's the way forward, that's the way to go. What you can see then is we do have books from the mid-12th century that begin to sort of corroborate a lot of this and show these contacts from continental Europe. Of course, the big upset in the late 12th century is the Anglo-Norman invasion, 1169-72, and I think that's a problem. At a popular level, we sort of always think of that as the watershed moment, you know. So, and at a crude level, for a long time, sort of in a crude popular history as well, you would get a sort of, well, you know, they were all barbarians before that, and then the English came and civilized them, and everything was okay, you know. So I think we need to sort of dispense with that idea of the Anglo-Norman invasion as such a watershed. There was an awful lot going on for 100 years or more, 150 years before the Anglo-Normans ever set foot here. And to complicate that as well, Ireland was in touch with that Norman world long before the Anglo-Normans actually set foot here. So there's a whole longer relationship and a very sort of exciting period before the Anglo-Normans ever set foot. I think if you do want to stick with those dates of the 1160s, 70s and the Anglo-Normans, I think what it does signify is the beginning of a closing in, of a looking more, we become less Eurocentric and more Anglocentric. I think that's really what begins there. So, let's go on and look at some of the music. I think the first thing I'd like to say about the music is, once we're dealing with music pre-1600, the tonality, if I can call it that, the grammar of the music is different. So we don't use major and minor scales that you're sort of familiar with today, that have been in use, you know, since around the time of Monteverdi. It's a modal tonality built on modes, so a different system of scales, but which you'll be familiar with, say, from a lot of Irish traditional music or from folk music and traditional music in lots of parts of Europe and outside Europe as well. I think in the Irish context, what happens is that when that shift happens on the continent from modality to major or minor tonality, it doesn't happen here at the same time. It's a slower process here for all sorts of historical reasons. If you think of what's going on here around 1600, the music is not to the forefront of their concerns. So what do we have book-wise and music-wise in terms of physical sources, those small number of sources that do survive from medieval Ireland that we can use then to tell us something about the musical culture? This first example is not Irish, but I put it up there just to show you. It's one of the earliest examples of European musical notation. It's from St. Gall in Switzerland, manuscript 359 from St. Gall, with chants for Good Friday. Now, looking at that, I don't know, you probably can't see it very well, but what you have there is the text in Latin and in Greek, and then above it, what look maybe to all intents and purposes like a series of squiggles. So that's our earliest music notation, these little neumes, pneumatic notation. Now that notation was very sophisticated, but it's difficult for us to use it. You have to again switch mentality and put yourself back in the mind of the singer. It worked for the singer at the time. Why? Because the singer already knew the melody from memory. So the purpose of the notation was not to sight read it. The purpose of the notation was as an aide-memoire, to remind the singer of something that he or she already knew. Remember that this is an annual cycle. We saw that liturgical year, you know, it's an annual cycle. So these texts, in this case, the improperia, the reproaches of Good Friday, Agios Otheos, Agios Eschiros, Agios Athanatos, and then goes into Latin, Sanctus Deus, Sanctus Fortis, etc. They're only sung once a year. You know, you only sing those on Good Friday. They're not trotted out as in some modern liturgies, every second day. These are proper texts specific to a day. They're not appropriate on any other day. So if you haven't sung this for a year, 365 days, you know it, it's in there, but you may just need some sort of little tweaking, a little reminder of how certain things go on, or how certain nuances in the melody, certain elements of rhythm, certain elements of ornamentation, and all of that information is encoded in that notation. So as I say, it's not primitive notation. There's nothing primitive about it. An older sort of history of music would have presented it in that way. It's actually highly sophisticated. But the question you have to ask is, what was the function of the notation? We don't approach it in our modern terms in terms of the function is that I can sight read it. No, the function is to remind somebody of something they already know. So that's the first European notation, first post-fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, there was notation in ancient Greece and Rome, but then that's lost and it's gone, and there's several centuries, up to about 850, 900. So if we want a sort of a starting date for musical notation in Europe, it's 850, 900. And the interesting thing is it starts simultaneously in about 3 different places, in the middle of what's now Switzerland, in northeastern France around Langres, and then over towards Chartres in western France. So there's a sort, but it's all territory that would have been part of the Holy Roman Empire, of the successor kingdoms to Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. If we move on a little bit from that notation, from that pneumatic notation, and we look at this, we're sort of on more familiar ground here, hopefully. This is 12th century Ireland. These are 2 folios, 2 pages from the Lismore Gradual, from Lismore in County Waterford, written around 1160, 1165. It's now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So this is, we could sing this off. There's a red 4-line staff there that you can see. The notation is a little different from our modern notation, but it is legible. There are little clefs there, B flat clefs and D clefs and B natural clefs and various things. What you're looking at on the left is the first folio with the introit of the Mass, the entrance chant of the Mass on the first Sunday of Advent, Ad Te Levavi, and of course, because it's the beginning of the liturgical year in the West, you tend to get those books, the first page is usually decorated, so you have a nice big A initial there, which is actually very South German in its artistic influence. On the right-hand side here, we have a series of rubrics, so details on how you set about organising the Palm Sunday procession, who does what, and how they're lined up, and then who sings what and who does what. And then you've got the chants, the beginning of the Palm Sunday procession. Pueri hebreorum tolentes ramos olivarum, etc., etc., and it goes on and that. Of course, the Palm Sunday procession was the most elaborate of the year in the medieval liturgy. Before the Feast of Corpus Christi was instituted, this was the big day where you went out through the city and out right through the city from the cathedral and out the city gates and back in again, and the whole populace was involved. It was a huge big thing. In terms of sort of its dramatic qualities and its musical qualities. So this is 12th century Ireland. Immediately, we can tell a few things from this. I don't have the time to go into huge detail, but let me just pick out a few little things. First of all, the style of notation here. We know for all sorts of reasons that this was written in Ireland in the 1150s. The scribes, they're not writing, it doesn't look like an Irish hand. Looking at that, you would think it was English or continental. So they're not writing, let me just show you what a typical Irish hand would have looked like in the 1150s. There, this Irish minuscule with this crazy R here, this sort of urne, Scandinavian urne influenced R, so resurrexi. That's typically Irish, and you wouldn't get that anywhere else. This is Irish as well, except it doesn't look it. Now, the reason I can say that is that every so often, when you look how the scribes are spelling their Latin, and you look what abbreviations the scribe use and other things, that's where they reveal their identity. They're revealing, what you can tell is you're dealing with 2 Irish scribes who were either trained by an Englishman or trained in England, but they're definitely Irish. They can't be anything else but Irish because of the way they spell their Latin. Simple example, Stephen, evangelist, or any of those words, evangelista, Stephanos, they don't spell it with ST, they spell it with a Z. So it becomes evangelizza, Stephanos. You only find that in Ireland. You don't find it in Scotland, Wales, anywhere else. It's a Hiberno-Latin thing that you only find here. So little things like that enable us to pin down the identity of the scribes. The second thing is the actual notation is Norman French. The closest parallels for that are around Rouen and the coast there. If you come down the estuary of the Seine, down to the coast, Fécamp, Jumièges, places like that down the estuary of the Seine, down by Rouen. So the influence in the notation is not coming from England. It's coming directly from northern France, from Normandy, interestingly, before the Anglo-Normans have set foot in Ireland. But of course, we know Dublin traded with Rouen via Chester. There was trade, and that shouldn't surprise us. They exported martins, wasn't it? Fur. There was a big fur trade with Rouen. So that's some Irish notation from the mid-12th century, from Lismore. Now, I'd like to move and connect this with polyphony. What I'm looking at there is what we would commonly call Gregorian chant, or plain chant. There are various terms for it: plain chant, Gregorian chant. The more sort of preferred academic term for it now would be Romanov Frankish chant, because we know actually that Pope Gregory the Great really had nothing to do with that's just a myth that he actually had anything to do with the creation of the repertory. But it is a Roman chant. So what that is, it's the chant that came from Rome in the late 8th century, so around the 750s. Charlemagne, the Frankish emperor, wants to sort of emulate Rome and emulate it in its music and create uniformity in his kingdom. So they bring up Roman singers from Rome to teach the repertory, the Roman repertory, the Cantus Romanus, to teach it to the Franks. But what happens in the process is, and there are all sorts of stories about this, and you can propaganda stories. The Roman side is that the Franks were too stupid and they couldn't learn the melodies. The Frankish side is that the Romans were too devious and taught them the wrong versions of the melodies. I think we need to get beyond that and not take those literally. I think what they're pointing out is that there was a problem. And so what happens actually in the process is that what you get a Roman tradition coming over the Alps into Francia, and then you get a local pre-existing tradition, a Frankish tradition, and you get a fusion of the two. And so that's why we use that term Romano-Frankish. And that fusion is what we take to be Gregorian chant or plain chant, the repertory that has continued for the last 1,000 years or so all over Europe. So that repertory, if you like to think of Gregorian chant or plain chant, think of it as the bread and butter. That is the staple diet of the Christian liturgy right through the medieval period. There are little variations in it, regional variations. So the way they might sing a particular chant in Ireland and the way they might sing it in Paris might be a little bit different. Let's take an example here. Easter Sunday morning from the Lismore Gradual, the opening chant, the intro is Resurrexi. In Lismore it's sung Resurrexi. Whereas if we go to France, let's go to Dijon in Burgundy, they will sing it Resurrexi. Did you notice the difference there? What was the difference? The Lismore is filled, the minor third is filled in Lismore, it's la la la, whereas in Dijon it's la la. Now, they're insignificant details, they're tiny details. Most people wouldn't have noticed them, except maybe the professional singers. And that's an important point to say, is that the singers in medieval churches were all professionals, they weren't amateurs. So they were highly important people within the ecclesiastical institutions. So the cantor, actually, the principal singer of a medieval monastery, was also usually the librarian. So they're very, very prestigious and important roles. They're not sort of some half-wit who thinks he can sing or strum the guitar. No. It's just important to say that those singers. So they probably would have noticed these differences, but most other people wouldn't have noticed the differences. But they're very useful for us 800, 900, 1,000 years later, because we can trace those and they're consistent. They're not sort of a scribe making a mistake. These little differences in the melodies are consistent through manuscripts and through regional traditions. And so I can tell you from that, the fact of the filled third there, la da da, that's going back to Winchester. They got that from Winchester in southern England. Winchester got it from Saint-Denis outside Paris, the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, which is now a pretty run-down suburb of Paris, but was a Royal Abbey for centuries. So that's a particular melody that has made its way from Saint-Denis to Winchester through certain places in southern England, Worcester, Christchurch, Canterbury, Exeter, and then makes its way over to Ireland. So you can actually begin to reconstruct a lot from a very close analysis of these musical sources, and you can begin to tell that a lot about it. Sometimes, in fact, the musical sources tell us stuff that no other documentary sources tell us about contexts that existed in Irish history. So if we say that this chant was the bread and butter, the mainstay that was sung day in and day out in the Christian liturgy and that people were familiar with, where does polyphony come in? Because that's what we want to talk about now, is polyphony. Well, initially, polyphony is always, the development of polyphony is totally connected with the chant in this period, from about 900 up to about 1200. So polyphony is seen as an embellishment of the chant. It's an embellishment of the chant, usually on the more important days of the year, the important feast days like Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, important saints' days and that. If you want to make the liturgy more elaborate, more sumptuous, more luxurious on those days, you have some polyphony. So that's the first thing to say, that it's an embellishment of the chant. It's always connected with the chant. So how does that manifest itself? You'd have a melody, the chant line might be this Resurrexi or Alleluia or something, and then you add another line against it, a polyphonic line. So if you like, the melody is already given. The principal voice, as it's called, or what later is called the cantus firmus, is already given, is chant, and you build around that. And that process continues right up to the Reformation, with the chant being central in that way. The second thing to say about early polyphony is that it is an improvised performance tradition. So any ideas about sort of somebody sitting down and writing a piece and then giving it to singers, you have to get that out of your head. That doesn't start until around 1200, 1180s, 1200. Before that, what you're actually talking about are these, that's why they're these highly skilled individuals, these highly skilled singers. A small group, we need to again get modern ideas of vast choirs and church choirs out of our head. The church choir in the medieval period would be maybe 5 singers, 5, 6 singers, 4, 5, 6 singers. That's it, you know. And of course, the term that was used for them was a schola. Schola cantorum was the term used in Rome. As you get into the later medieval period, they're just often called the chorus. And then, of course, if they're singing elaborate polyphony on continental Europe, there'll be maybe a cappella musicale and that. But the schola, or the chorus, is a small group of professional singers, you know. And that's not to say that others are excluded, but they're the ones who sing the elaborate pieces. They're the ones who sing the polyphony. They're the ones who sing the complex pieces. So they're highly trained singers. They know certain rules in their head, how to do certain things, what intervals you can use and what intervals you can't use. You begin at the unison or the octave. You can begin at a fifth, you must end on a unison octave, things like that. You can do this and you can do that. So there's a whole lot of treatises that exist from actually around the 800s onwards that are basically telling you how to make polyphony. In fact, one of them is called that, ad organum fatiendum, so how to make polyphony. This is how you do it. And so the singers then go out and do it. So it's sort of, it's ephemeral. You take 2 singers, they go out on Easter Sunday morning, and one of them sings the verse of the Alleluia in the chant, and the other one improvises on it within given rules. And that's it. It's happened. There's no way to record it. It's gone. It's off in the air. That's it. They may never do it the same way again. The next time they do it, it may be different. So it's a very different aesthetic, a very different mentality. Now, what I'd like to do is illustrate that for you with some level, if our singers here can come forward, and just take a few examples. And what we're going to get them to do here is show you just at the sort of the crudest and most basic level. If you go back to about 850, what you'll be familiar with is sort of organum. So if we take a melody and follow it at a parallel of a fifth or a parallel of a fourth. So that's at a most basic level, you know, that's sort of child's play in some ways. So what we're going to do here, we thought we would take the hymn Utque and Laxis, which is the hymn for Vespers of the Feast of St. John the Baptist on the 24th of June. But it's also a very important hymn because you're all familiar with it, because your tonic solfa comes from it. So you get your syllables ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, all come from the beginning of each line of that hymn. Utque and Laxis, resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, solve polluti, labi beatum. And then ut became do in Romance languages and in English, and T was added centuries later. So we might just take, we'll take this, just the unison melody first, then we'll add an organum at the fifth, an organum at the fifth and the fourth.
Utque an laxis resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, solve polluti, labi beatum, Sancte Johannes. Utque an laxis resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, solve polluti, labi beatum, Sancte Johannes.
Thank you. So that's at your sort of most basic level. You don't need to be very skilled, with all due respects to our very skilled singers. You know, children could do that and did it. You know. You're just following, but of course that gets boring after a while as well. If you're just following the melody at, you know, in parallel organum. But it's at your most basic level how you begin to combine voices. You could add a drone to that as well. You could do various things. If we jump on a little bit, but so back to our Lismore gradual, because that throws up something else for us as well. Very interesting is the contacts between Ireland and France in the 12th century. Definite contacts, and with a particular place in France, with Chartres. where you're all familiar with Cathedral of Chart now, but that's a later building, 13th century, with the wonderful stained glass. But Chart in the 12th century had a very famous cathedral school. So we're talking the period before the emergence of the University of Paris and the other great universities, and these are the precursors of the universities. So if you're a talented Irish guy and you want a good education, well, and you can do it, you're going to head to Chart. What's interesting is that the Lismore gradual, Chart had a thriving polyphonic tradition. Now, again, it's this simple polyphony. We're talking about two voices, or maybe 2 parts or 3 parts, no more than that, often just 2 parts. And for 2 parts, it's a soloistic art as well. So all you need are 2 singers, 2 very good singers, but you don't need a whole mob, just 2 good singers, that's it, 1 for each part. And we have a lot of that from Chart. The link with Chart and Ireland is interesting because this little diagram here, this weird Greek lambda letter with all sorts of numbers through it and it's all linked up. It's too complicated to explain in detail now, but that's a music theory diagram. It's in a text of the Plato Chalcidius Timaeus that's now in the Bodleian in Oxford, but it was written probably in Glendalough. It was certainly written around the Glendalough area in the first half of the 12th century. And it's written by an Irishman who clearly had studied at the Cathedral School in Chart a few decades earlier. And the reason we can say that is because of the glosses, the little notes that are added in other parts of the manuscript, all reflect the teaching of William of Chart and of some other teachers from the School of Chart at the Cathedral School in the early 12th century. So that's the first Chart link with sort of this part of the world, definite link. That's sort of, it's somebody who studied there. It's not somebody who's got it second hand. He studied in Chart and he's back home in Ireland now and obviously producing this for others. The second is this in the Lismore gradual. If we look here, we have a chant for Easter Sunday, for the procession on Easter Sunday morning. There was always a big procession on Easter Sunday morning. Christus resurgens ex mortuis, and then it goes into a verse, so that's the antiphon, and then the verse, Dicant nunc Judei, we won't, a little bit anti-Semitic, but we won't go there now. But this verse was often sung polyphonically. And if you can see here, there are 2 things just to notice about this. First of all, the wavy line here. So here's the chant version, and here's the polyphonic version above. And actually there's little sort of what look like bar lines. They're not really, they're just actually to guide in terms of the text. Again, the notation here pointing to France, the layout, this layout is very unusual at the time. We take this for granted now, this what we call score format. Score format wasn't used until much later in music, but it's used in a few places in the 12th century, and one of those is Burgundy. So all around Burgundy, Vézelay in particular, and from Vézelay it makes its way off to Santiago de Compostela and the Cornica Scripts. So the layout here in Lismore in the 1160s is exactly the same as the layout of Burgundian polyphony and the sort of stuff that made its way to Santiago de Compostela. But there's another more interesting thing about this. This particular version that has been notated in Lismore is actually very close to a Chart version. So what we have here are 2 versions, one from Chart and the Lismore version below. The points where there's a little red-yellow box here are where they differ. And anywhere else the melodies are exactly the same. Now the chances, given the possibilities with improvised polyphony, you're doing this, you have to work within a framework and certain rules, but you have a lot of freedom what you do within that framework. The chances of getting these 2 versions so close together, the only way you can explain that is there has to be a direct connection. The Lismore version is dependent on the earlier Chart version. The Chart version is from about 1100, the Lismore version is from about 1150, 1160. There's a direct connection there. I'd like to move on from that, and this is also from mid-12th century Ireland, a little fun piece, very, very short, called Cornica Scripts. So what this is, I should explain this. This is in a psalter, so Book of Psalms, of the 150 Psalms of the Old Testament. And the Psalms, of course, were central to Christian liturgy. They were just taken over from the Jewish synagogue and then became the centre, both in terms of mass texts. People often say that, Catholics didn't know the Bible. Well, the entire proper texts of the medieval mass are scriptural. They're not, they're nothing else. They're all the Psalms. So this is the Book of Psalms. It's a beautiful little ornate book. It's in the British Library now. It is divided into 3 sections: the first 50 Psalms, the second 50, and the third and the last 50. So that's the way the Irish divided the Psalter. It's in Irish manuscript script. It's very Irish. And then you have this blank page here. What has he done? The scribe has signed himself here. But how has he signed himself? He's told us who he is, Cormacus. Now, if he's called Cormac, he can only be from one country, and that's Ireland. It's a name that didn't travel. He signed himself in music. And I think there's a very subtle little intellectual game going on here, because if you ask yourself the question, where would he sing this? Cornica Scripts et hoc salterium ora proeo. Cormac wrote this psalter, please pray for him. Qui legis haec ora processe qualibet horas. So whenever you read this, please remember and pray for him. That's not, you can't sing that in the liturgy. That can't be sung anywhere. That's not meant to be sung. This is an intellectual game. And as Susan Rankin has said, what better way to sign yourself if you've just put together a book of psalms, which are texts that are intended to be sung, not texts that are intended to be read. They're musical texts. Then to sign yourself, showing off your ability, your literacy, your musical literacy in musical notation. So here we have, again, score format, notation that points to Burgundy and to Benedictine influences, not Cistercian influences, as some art historians have claimed, and very similar to the sort of material in the Codex Calixtinus, the book that made its way from Vesle to Santiago de Compostela. So we might just hear this as a little example. Actually, this is one of the only two notated examples of three-part polyphony in the 12th century, so it's quite a unique, rare little thing. So I'd like to take a little jump from the 12th century on in terms of what we have surviving in terms of polyphony from later medieval Ireland. And here we sort of, might get myself to hot water. One of the big questions at a very crude level that we often sort of, maybe if we don't articulate it, that often goes through our minds is, why did Ireland not produce any great composers in the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century? If Scotland could do it and produce a Robert Carver in the 16th century, why did Ireland produce nobody like a Tallis or a Bird or that? Where was it because, as I often say, they were all muck savages and they were, barbarous and they could, Or if you want to swing to the other extreme and you say, well, we didn't need any of that stuff because we had our traditional music, the Irish exceptional and stuff, and we're not European and all this sort of rubbish. So how do we I think it's an important one, just in terms of national psyche and everything. How do we tackle this? How do we deal with that? And how do we explain it reasonably? I think my own view on this is that the key to this is this whole idea of the interrelationship between improvised polyphony, and there's a term in Latin for that right through the Middle Ages up to the Reformation, cantare super librum, to sing on the book. So that improvised polyphony on the one hand, and then composed polyphony on the other hand. Now, by composed, I mean by Bird, by Tallis, by Dufay, by Ockeghem, by any of the great composers, in that sense, that somebody sat down and produced this and then, that. So I think one of our problems is that an older, conservative, outdated history of music has put all the emphasis on the great composers. When we all have a tendency to do that. So you emphasize all of that. And the danger in that is also that you emphasize the great metropolitan, cosmopolitan centres. The Papal Chapel in Rome, the greatest choir, in the medieval world, in the Renaissance world. The English Chapel Royal, the French Chapel Royal, the Burgundian Ducal Chapel, any of those. And we get off, I think, on the wrong, we start making the wrong comparisons. We start comparing then what's going on in Dublin with what's going on in Brussels or Dijon or someplace, or what's going on in Paris or what's going on in Rome. And we've got the whole wrong thing. We can't even compare with England because we're a much smaller country, not as rich a country economically and all that. The resources weren't here. And a crucial thing, the aristocratic patronage was not here. You did not have, I keep saying that, you did not have a royal court. And a royal court is key to so much to patronage. You didn't even have a ducal court like the Dukes of Burgundy. What had we got? We got earls, and that was really it. The Earls of Kildare, very prestigious. The Earls of Ormond. That's as high as you get in terms of an aristocracy in medieval Ireland. So you don't have the physical conditions for the sort of patronage. If you're a talented young Irishman, I think in the 14th century, the 15th century, really talented, you're going to go elsewhere because the jobs are not in Dublin. The outlets, the money is in Dublin. Half the archbishops of Dublin are absentee landlords. They're not here at the time. So that's a reality I think we have to factor into that. So how does that world work then? What happens in that world? Is it that nothing happens, that they don't sing polyphony, or that there is, or that they are, well, we have to be open-minded about it. The sources don't survive. They may well have been singing Dufai and singing Ockegem and that, although I doubt it somehow, but nothing survives. But what we can say is, we can say a little bit of what they were singing, and there's an example from St. Patrick's Cathedral that gives us a glimpse into that world. And in relation to that, I'd just like to say the dates of the foundation, how do we interpret those? The foundation of the choir schools at St. Patrick's and Christchurch would be the two principal Irish examples, 1432 and 1480. I think that's to do with the foundation of those choir schools. That's actually to do with the singing of polyphony, the singing of composed polyphony. That's not to say that there was no singing before that. Of course there was singing before that, right back to the foundation of those buildings. But the singing was being done by the schola, by adult male clerics. So what happens then, what these dates represent, 1432 and 1480, is bringing in boys. There may have been boys there before that, because there are references to boys singing in Lismore in the 12th century, and it was natural that a cathedral had a school and educated boys. But I think this is to do with, it's actually to do with a specific type of singing. It's these cathedrals wanting to focus on composed polyphony, on that. So they need, they're bringing these boys in, they're educating them, they're putting them in that direction. If we look at St. Patrick's, it's interesting. This example, it's in a book called the Dublin Troper. So this is a book of chant for St. Patrick's Cathedral. There's the chants for Corpus Christi. But at the back of the book is this very sort of almost very roughly, badly written, sort of messy, but actually legible piece of three-voice polyphony. And here we're looking at an example of this improvised polyphony. So this is not a piece that somebody sat down and composed and then wrote. I think what we're looking at here is this is a piece that was improvised in the cathedral in St. Patrick's. Maybe they improvised it, it was done a few times. Somebody from hearing it thought it was I like that way they do it. I like that particular version, the way those three singers did it. And he writes it down. He records it for posterity. And that is actually the history of early polyphony. What the written polyphony, right from the 1100s up, is the tip of the iceberg. It's what was exceptional, and so somebody wrote it down so that it wouldn't be sort of completely lost. And I think that's what we're looking at here. So we're not looking at a piece of composed polyphony. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a thing called a prose for the Feast of the Annunciation on the 25th of March, Angelus et Virginem. A lot of you will know it because it was then popularised as a Christmas carol in the late 19th century. Angelus et Virginem, ba 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 ba. It's written in mensural notation. But what we're looking at here is a real example of how we know it's improvised polyphony is the way it works when you analyse it. First of all, the chant part, Angelus et Virginem, is in the middle. So you put a voice above it and a voice below it. You don't, as on the continent, put the melody on the top. Now, what's that typical of? That's typical of English Faubourden. So typical 14th century English Faubourden. That's how they did it in England. And Patrick's certainly was a bastion of English government and ecclesiastical influence in Ireland. And then the intervals. You sing the melody above the chant melody, you sing at a fourth, and below you sing at a third. Now, it doesn't follow that exactly the whole way, but it does work. So we're looking at an example there of improvised 14th century English Faubourden that somebody in Patrick's happened to then write down in later years, probably in the early 15th century or first half of the 15th century. So let's just have a listen to that, how it sounds. You'll hear some strange sounds, strange intervals in it, but they're all there. They're all meant to be there.
Angelus ad Virginem sub intrans in conclave, Virginis formidinem nemulcens inquitare, Ave Regina Virginum, Celitereque Dominum, Concipies et paries intacta, Salutem hominum, tu porta celi facta, vedele criminum. Angelus ad Virginem sub intrans in conclave, Virginis formidinem nemulcens inquitave, Ave Regina Virginum, Celitereque Dominum, Concipies et paries intacta, Salutem hominum, tu porta celi facta, medela criminum.
So I think the important point about this sort of improvised polyphony is if you have three singers You already know the chant, so that's taking care of one part. You just need two other singers then who know the rules of how this works, and one can do the upper voice and one can do the lower voice. And important point in relation to this is that this wasn't just poor man's polyphony or something where they, you find this being done in prestigious institutions, the Burgundian Ducal Chapel, the Papal Chapel. We know it from the Papal Chapel. You take a wet November evening, a Wednesday evening in November, or a Wednesday evening in November in St. Patrick's, half the singers are sick. They don't turn up. You have Vespers or Evensong now. You can still sing polyphony. You mightn't be able to sing, an Ockegem motet, but you have your three singers. You can do this cantare super librum. You can sing on the book. You've got the chant, and you embellish the chant. So I think that is the element that we certainly have the evidence from, a continuous tradition in Ireland from the 12th century right up to the Reformation. I think the economic conditions were not here in terms of patronage and that for the development of a composed polyphonic tradition. I think if there was talent here, probably left and went abroad, went to England or went elsewhere. I just want to finish on an interesting little comment. This is the secretary of the Archduke Ferdinand, who was on his way back from Spain after the coronation of his brother Charles V as King of Spain. They're on their way back to Spanish Netherlands, to Flanders, in 1518 in June, and they pull in out of a storm into Kinsale for a few days. And he tells us a lot about Kinsale. It's a very interesting account that Hiram Morgan has edited. But what I find interesting is here, they go to Mass on Sunday in Kinkasal, as he puts it in French. And he comments that they sang in counterpoint, now, which was neither discant nor plain chant, but they have a completely different manner of singing than from over here. Now we need to be careful with anything like that, because this Laurent Vital may have known nothing about music. He may just have been pulling those terms out. He may have known the word counterpoint and distant, or he may have known. It's very hard to make out, what exactly he's saying. The reason, though, that I put it up there is interesting, because it is commenting on difference. That what they're doing in Kinsale, it's counterpoint, it's polyphony, but it's not the same as what we do back in Flanders, in Bruges or Ghent or Brussels or that. That's about one of the few examples of difference you can find. It's interesting if you go right back to the 12th century, when outsiders are commenting on music in Ireland. We take the famous example of Giraldus Cambrensis. They never talk about otherness. They never talk about difference. So this whole idea that Ireland was exceptional and somehow non-European and not connected with Europe, that outsiders don't see that. They don't comment on that. What is Giraldus saying? Giraldus was no friend of the Irish. I mean, he's nothing very good to say about the Irish. But he says, he goes on about the skill of the harpers, the descriptions of the harpers, and the great skill, the musical skill of the Irish. He doesn't talk about difference, though. He doesn't, there's no... And so I think this whole idea of otherness, my view is that, just to finish up on this, is that our medieval musical tradition was thoroughly European. But I think we need to be careful with that in making comparisons, that we don't make comparisons with our two biggest neighbours, which were extremely rich and very highly developed kingdoms, the French kingdom and the English kingdom, that we need to make the comparisons with areas of similar size, similar economic conditions, similar culture conditions. So, Norway, Croatia, places like that. And then I think the picture that begins to emerge is, and even smaller urban centres in those great kingdoms rather than the capital cities, then the picture that emerges is actually, we were actually no better, no worse than the equivalent communities and cultures in other parts of Europe. Thank you.